20 milligrams of epinephrine. That was the only thing standing between Agent Sterling and a permanent sleep. The FBI team was 10 seconds from breaching my door, unaware their lead officer was dying on my floor from a neurotoxin I had not seen since Aleppo. My radio hissed, Julian Vane's voice, a ghost from the static. He was counting down. I did not wait for the door to explode. I plunged the needle home. The liquid disappeared into the muscle with a muted resistance that my thumb registered as a familiar. Tactile pressure. Outside. The Seattle rain hammered against the glass of the trauma wing. A relentless, percussive drumming that masked the high-pitched whine of the hospital's aging fluorescent lights. The air in the unit was a thick slurry of industrial-grade bleach and the metallic tang of dried blood, a scent that always seemed to cling to the back of my throat. I stood back, the empty syringe still held between my gloved fingers, watching the rise and fall of Sterling's chest. The pager in my scrub pocket began its rhythmic, mechanical buzz, a coded pulse that sliced through the white noise of the rain, signalling a reality I had tried for years to bury. The hallway outside Trauma Bay 1 was a stage for my public execution, and Dr. Vanderbilt was the eager executioner. He moved with a practiced arrogance, his leather soles clicking sharply on the linoleum like a metronome of disdain. He did not just walk, he occupied space as if he owned the very molecules of oxygen we breathed. With a flick of his wrist, he threw the instrument tray down. The metal tray clattered with a sharp, dissonant ring that vibrated in my teeth. The young nurses shifted their weight, their eyes avoiding mine. A collective silence that felt heavier than the medical equipment surrounding us. "Vance," Vanderbilt barked, his voice dripping with a calculated cruelty. He looked at my left leg, the slight tilt of my hip that I could never quite mask. "You are a liability to this floor." A mute janitor scraping the bottom of the barrel. "Why we keep you on the graveyard shift is a mystery. Even the board cannot solve." He leaned in closer, the scent of expensive espresso and cold indifference radiating from him. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation, a prickling heat that started at the base of my neck. I did not give him the satisfaction of a flinch. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second and engaged tactical breathing. 4, 4, 4, 4. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Hold for 4. The chaos of the hallway blurred into a distant hum. I focused on the microphysics of my own survival, the way my lungs expanded against my ribs, the steady, rhythmic beat of my heart sitting at 62. I analysed his posture. His shoulders were tight, his pupils slightly dilated. He was overcompensating for a lack of sleep and a failing ego. I remained an anchor of quiet dignity in the wake of his storm. Then, a new vibration entered the room. It was not the sound of the hospital. It was a low-frequency diesel thrum that crawled up through the soles of my shoes and settled in my marrow. Bearcat engines? 2 miles out and closing fast. I glanced at the bedside radio. The light was on, but only a surgical cut of white noise came through. Active jamming. They were not just coming for Sterling, they were coming to erase everything I had built here. The hospital's internal rhythm began to fracture. The diesel thrum intensified, a mechanical predator approaching through the downpour. I stood exactly 2 feet back from the window, keeping my silhouette tucked into the deep shadow of the corner, a habit carved into my soul from years in the 160th SOAR. I looked at Martha, Eleanor Reed, resting in the next bay, her breathing fragile and shallow. The perimeter was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage. I reached into my pocket and crushed a piece of nicotine gum, the acrid bitterness grounding me as the first flash of tactical lights cut through the rain outside. Vanderbilt was still talking. his mouth moving in a silent movie of insults. Completely unaware that the world was about to explode around him, the pager buzzed again, more frantic now, a mechanical death rattle in the dark. I felt the weight of my past pressing against the present, a crushing force that demanded a choice I was not ready to make. The glass in the main entrance shattered, the sound travelling up the elevator shaft like a final, jagged breath. The hospital's atmosphere shifted from sterile order to a frantic, dissonant chaos in the space of a heartbeat. The monitor in Trauma Bay 1 began to beep dissonantly, a high-pitched, uneven rhythm that signalled Sterling's autonomic system was fighting a losing battle against the toxin. Above us, the ventilator hissed, a sharp, rhythmic intake of air that sounded like a mechanical lung being torn open. The wheels of incoming stretchers screeched on the floor, a sound of metal on linoleum that set my nerves on edge. I watched the fluorescent lights flicker as the jamming signal intensified, casting long, jagged shadows across the unit. The smell of ozone and wet pavement drifted in from the shattered entrance, mixing with the cloying scent of bleach. My adrenaline surged, a cold, electric fire in my veins that threatened to make my hands shake. I forced my lungs into the 4-4-4-4 cycle again, fighting the phantom heat of a Syrian sun that always seemed to rise in moments of crisis. Dr. Vanderbilt stood at the centre of the intake bay, his imperial posture collapsing into a visible tremor. He looked at the chaos, the flashing lights, the shouting tactical teams, the dying agent on the floor, and his mind simply stopped. It was decision paralysis, a clinical freezing of the cognitive gears that I had seen a dozen times in the field. He held a syringe of Narcan, his fingers fumbling with the cap, his gaze vacant. He was not a doctor anymore. He was a civilian, lost in a war zone. I did not wait for him to find his footing. I moved with a surgical silence, my limp forgotten as I navigated the tight space between the equipment. I began prepping the intubation kit, my movements economical and precise. I did not announce my actions. I simply placed the laryngoscope and the ET tube exactly where the hand would need them, my shadow falling over Vanderbilt as he continued to stare at the doorway. I was a ghost in the room, a silent operator functioning in the gaps of his failure, my quiet dignity a stark contrast to his loud, useless fear. The doors to the trauma unit did not just open, they were breached. Dominic Sterling's FBI team poured in, a sea of tactical nylon and matte black hardware. The beams of their weapon-mounted lights sliced through the dim air, landing on my chest and Vanderbilt's wide, terrified eyes. Sterling himself was a hunter in the dark, his muzzle fixed on me as he stepped over the threshold. He ignored the monitor's scream, his focus entirely on the woman standing over his lead officer with a needle in her hand. Behind me, Eleanor Reed let out a thin, ragged gasp, the sound of a heart finally surrendering to the pressure. The stress of the breach had triggered a total cardiovascular collapse. I felt her distress in the air before I heard it. "Stay where you are." Sterling's voice was a whip crack, the safety on his rifle clicking off with a sound that felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. He did not see a nurse. He saw a ghost he had been hunting for 2 decades, Captain Vance. Step away from the patient. Now I did not step back. I looked Sterling in the eye, giving him the 1,000-yard stare that stripped away his badge and his authority. I analysed the tension in his trigger finger, the slight sweat on his brow. He was professional, but he was drowning in the scale of the MCI. My tactical breathing remained my rhythm, a hidden drumbeat that kept the trauma at bay. I leaned over Eleanor, my hand finding the junctional bleed on her neck that the monitors had not even registered yet. The warmth of her blood soaked into my glove. A dark, viscous reminder of the stakes. The monitor's beep shifted from a frantic rhythm to the long, flat tone of a total arrest. I felt the vibration of the entire hospital shudder as another bearcat slammed into the loading dock below. Sterling's muzzle did not waver, but I saw the first flicker of doubt in his eyes as he realized the woman he was here to arrest was the only person in the room who knew how to stop the bleeding. I looked down at the dark stain spreading across the white sheets, the open loop of my past finally pulling tight. The monitor's dissonant scream was a flat, jagged line of electronic despair that cut through the frantic shouts of the trauma team. Agent Sterling, now identified as my primary VIP, was sliding into a permanent darkness, and the bay was drowning in the wrong kind of noise. Dr. Vanderbilt stood over him, his hands placed correctly, but his weight shifted too far back. His compressions a shallow, useless mimicry of life-saving force. I watched the microphysics of his failure, the way his shoulders shrugged with every downstroke, the lack of recoil that allowed the heart to refill. My analytic overlay registered the primary threat, not as the toxin, but as the procedural incompetence standing in the way of survival. I looked down, past the frantic movement of the team, and saw the dark, viscous stain spreading from Sterling's groin. It was not just a seep, it was a rhythmic, pulsing flood, a junctional femoral bleed. Every time Vanderbilt pressed on that chest, he was not circulating blood to the brain, he was simply accelerating the emptying of the human vessel. The trauma bay felt like a pressurized chamber, the air heavy with the scent of copper and the electric hum of failing equipment. I did not ask for permission. I moved. I stepped into the tight orbit of the coding bed, my left leg dragging a millisecond behind the rest of my body, but my trajectory was absolute. I shoulder-charged the medtech who was performing the ventilation. A sharp, lateral force that sent him stumbling back toward the supply cart. The room froze for a fraction of a second, the sudden, violent breach of hospital decorum more shocking to them than the death on the table. I grabbed Vanderbilt's wrists, my fingers digging into the expensive fabric of his white coat with a strength that felt like iron. "Stop compressions," I said. My voice was a low-frequency vibration that seemed to silence the monitors. "You are pumping the blood out of him." Vanderbilt's eyes were wide, vacant, trapped in the amber of his own decision paralysis. He did not fight me. He simply withered, his authority evaporating as he realized I was no longer Sarah the nurse. I saw the threat assessment shift in the eyes of the young staff nurses. They saw the Captain Vance, the woman who had performed triage under mortar fire in Aleppo, rising through the mask of a janitor. I dropped my weight, shifting my center of gravity until my knee locked against the side of the bed. I clenched my right hand into a solid, heavy fist. I did not use a bandage or a clamp. I went for the bone. I drove my knuckles deep into the junction of Sterling's hip, aiming for the spot where the femoral artery crossed the sharp ridge of the pelvic brim. The crimp. I felt the initial resistance of muscle, followed by the terrifying, liquid heat of arterial blood spraying through the gaps between my fingers. The pressure was immense. A hot, rhythmic pounding that fought against my hand with every desperate beat of his heart. I leaned my entire body weight into that single point of contact, grinding my fist against the bone to create a manual seal. The monitor's flatline did not break immediately, but the spray stopped. I could feel the mechanical feedback of his pulse thumping against my knuckles, a visceral, brutal connection between his life and my strength. The bay went silent. The only sound, the ragged hiss of the ventilator and the heavy thud of my own tactical breathing. 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold. The long tone of the monitor finally broke, replaced by a weak, uneven blip. Sinus bradycardia. It was the sound of a soul being pulled back from the edge by sheer, bloody force. Sterling's chest rose, a shallow but genuine intake of air. I stayed there, anchored to the bed by my own fist, my scrubs soaked to the elbow in federal blood. The crimp was holding, but it was a crude, temporary bridge. Vanderbilt was staring at my hand, at the way the blood was pooling around my knuckles, his mouth working silently as the system began its inevitable counterattack. The administrative machinery of St. Jude's was already grinding into motion. I could feel the cold, bureaucratic air entering the bay. A senior administrator, Quinlan, appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the mess I had made of his sterile bay. He did not see a life saved. He saw a liability. 2 security guards moved in behind him, their hands on their belts. I did not move my fist. I looked at Vanderbilt, then at Sterling's stabilizing rhythm. I knew the cliff was coming. They were not going to thank me. They were going to sacrifice me to the procedure. The transition from the high-octane heat of the trauma bay to the sterile, frigid silence of the main lobby felt like a decompression sickness of the soul. Administrator Quinlan stood before me, his face a mask of bureaucratic iron, holding a sheaf of digital discharge papers that felt like a death warrant. The administrative counterstrike had been swift. No debrief, no medical review, just a cold, immediate push to extract the Sarah Vance liability from the system before the legal repercussions could solidify. You are being placed on immediate administrative leave, effective 1 minute ago, Quinlan said, his voice a flat, clinical drone that echoed off the vaulted marble of the public space. Your credentials have been revoked. Security will escort you to the perimeter. I looked at my hands. I had washed the blood off, but the skin was still red and raw from the friction of the crimp. I could feel the gaze of the staff and the lingering patients, a heavy, shaming weight that sought to reduce me back to the broken woman with a limp. They were trying to erase the ghost before it could speak. I walked toward the glass doors, the security guards flanking me like shadows of a system that thrived on my silence. The main lobby of St. Jude's was an expanse of white stone and cold, dramatic lighting, a place designed to evoke trust through architecture, while the reality behind the curtains was falling apart. Every step I took felt like a strategic withdrawal, my left leg dragging slightly on the polished floor, the sound a rhythmic reminder of my own fragility. I analysed the guards. They were relaxed, their threat assessment of an old nurse sitting at 0. They did not see the way I scanned the exits, or how I registered the shadow of the bearcat still idling in the ambulance bay outside. Then, the lobby fell into a sudden, absolute silence. It was a vacuum of sound, the kind that precedes a massive atmospheric shift. The chatter of the reception desk died. The shuffling of feet stopped. The air seemed to be sucked out of the room, leaving only the cold, humming tension of the emergency lights. Something was coming that Quinlan's paperwork could not stop. The silence was shattered by a single explosive sound. Crack! It was the synchronized impact of 20 pairs of heavy tactical boots hitting the marble in a perfect military unison. The sound echoed like a gunshot, vibrating through the glass walls and settling in my teeth. From the darkened corridors of the intake wing, a column of Blackwell specialists emerged, moving with a disciplined, rhythmic precision that made the hospital security look like children. They did not shout. They did not point weapons. They simply occupied the lobby, their presence a surgical intervention in a civilian space. At the head of the column was Commander Reed Sterling's superior, a man whose face was a map of hard choices and deep scars. He stopped 10 feet from me, ignoring Quinlan, ignoring the guards, ignoring the entire administrative facade of St. Jude's. He looked at me, and for the first time in 20 years, the mask of Sarah the nurse felt like it was dissolving. The staff watched, frozen in a state of collective shock, as the power dynamic of the entire building was forcibly inverted by the arrival of a higher law. Commander Reed did not offer a speech. He did not need to. He stood at rigid attention, his eyes fixed on mine with a professional intensity that bypassed the trauma and the limp. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he brought his hand to his brow in a perfect, crisp salute. Behind him, 20 tactical operators followed suit, the sound of their movement a soft, metallic rustle in the dead air. It was a recognition of the SOAR captain, a silent acknowledgement of the crimp and the woman who had held a federal life together with her bare knuckles. The reversal was total. Vanderbilt, watching from the mezzanine, looked like a man who had just seen a ghost walk through a wall. Quinlan's papers fluttered in the sudden draft from the air vents. Just as the weight of the moment reached its peak, the lights in the lobby flickered and died. The emergency red glow kicked in, bathing the marble in a bloody low-light haze. A deep, mechanical groan vibrated through the floor, the sound of the main power grid being severed. The Blackwood breach had begun, and the silence was about to be replaced by the scream of a city under siege. The Blackwood breach had not just severed the power, it had severed Chicago from the rest of the civilized world, leaving it a hollowed-out carcass of steel and glass. By the time we crossed the city line in a nondescript Blackwell Suburban, the metropolis had transformed into a ghost. Its familiar skyline now, a jagged silhouette against a bruised purple sky. The rhythmic thrum of the engine was the only constant as we navigated the concrete canyons, now bathed in the eerie, flickering strobe of emergency beacons that cast long, distorted shadows across the abandoned cars. Cordon lines of National Guard Humvees blocked the major arteries, their heavy machine guns tracking our movement with a cold mechanical indifference that felt like a predator watching its prey. I watched through the tinted glass, my left leg aching with a dull, throbbing pressure that seemed to intensify with every vibration of the road. It was not just pain. It was a localized weather system of trauma. Every checkpoint was a reminder of the scale of the escalation, a legal hold on an entire population that no lawyer or politician could break. The air outside, filtered through the car's scrubbers, felt heavy and pressurized, carrying the faint, acrid scent of ozone and the distant, low-frequency roar of jet turbines circling high above the cloud layer. We pulled up to the perimeter of the Vane lab, a brutalist concrete monolith that seemed designed to absorb light and hope in equal measure. Sterling moved with a surgical intensity, his eyes scanning the shadowed loading docks for any sign of a perimeter breach or a Blackwell scout. I followed him, my tactical breathing 4 in, 4 hold, 4 out, 4 hold, keeping my heart rate at a steady 64 beats per minute, an artificial calm in a world spiraling toward collapse. We slipped through a side entrance, the heavy steel door yielding to Sterling's bypass kit with a soft, electronic click that sounded like a bone snapping in the silence. Inside, the atmosphere was an immediate enemy. The temperature had plummeted, and the air was thick with the suffocating smell of industrial-grade chlorine and the metallic, cloying tang of dried blood. It was the scent of a slaughterhouse that had been bleached but never truly cleaned, the chemical sharp enough to burn the lining of my nostrils. I registered the threat immediately. The lab was not just abandoned, it was a tomb waiting for its next occupant, the silence vibrating with the ghosts of whatever had happened before the lights went out. Sterling signaled for a silent advance, his weapon at the low ready, the tactical light on his barrel slicing through the gloom in nervous, jagged arcs. We moved into the central research bay, where rows of shattered incubators looked like the rib cages of dead giants, their glass teeth scattered across the floor like diamonds in the dust. I stopped to analyze a splatter on the wall, the deep crimson stain telling a story of high-pressure arterial spray that had long since congealed into a dark, brittle crust. My analytic overlay kicked in. 3 victims, likely researchers caught in the first wave of the breach, taken down with clinical, terrifying precision. No struggle, no waste. This was Vane's signature, the surgical cut of a predator who understood human anatomy better than morality. I looked at Sterling. His jaw was tight, his focus fixed on a flickering terminal in the corner that hissed with static. He was a trained hunter, a man of rules and warrants, but he was visibly out of his depth in a place where the predators were microscopic and the rules had been rewritten by a madman. The silence in the bay was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, taunting drip of a leaking pipe and the distant, muffled thud of a National Guard chopper circling overhead like a carrion bird. I moved toward a primary containment unit, the reinforced glass etched with the silhouette of a biohazard symbol that seemed to glow in the red emergency light. Inside, a single vial sat on a motorized rack, its contents a clear, deceptively innocent liquid that caught the light like a teardrop. The shadow doctor had been here, and he had left his scent in the calculated arrangement of the equipment, a ghost of the man I had watched burn in the ruins of a Syrian hospital. Sterling approached the terminal, his fingers dancing over the keys as he bypassed the secondary encryption with a grunt of professional satisfaction. "We have access," he whispered, the blue light of the screen casting long, jagged shadows across his face that made him look like a stranger. I did not look at the screen. I looked at the dark, blackened veins on the arm of a nearby corpse, the skin pulled tight over the bone like parchment. It was the Aleppo signature. The ticking clock was not just for the city, it was in the room with us, a silent countdown in the very air we breathed. Just as Sterling reached for the data drive, the lab's internal intercom crackled to life with a sound like a dying breath. A voice, cold and devoid of any human inflection, filled the empty space, and I realized Julian Vane was not a memory anymore. He was the architect of the end. The intercom hissed with a sound like escaping steam before Julian Vane's voice settled into the room, a dry, academic tone that made the temperature feel as if it had plummeted another 10 degrees. "Captain Vance," he said, the name hitting me with the weight of a physical blow to the solar plexus. "I knew you would not stay dead. You always had a stubborn, irrational refusal to follow the triage." I stood frozen, my fist clenched so tightly around the strap of my field kit that my knuckles turned white, the microphysics of my pulse hammering against the sensitive skin of my throat. Sterling spun around in a frantic lateral motion, his weapon tracking the overhead speakers as if he could shoot the sound out of the air. The shadow doctor did not just know me. He was inviting me into the heart of his nightmare with the familiarity of an old colleague. I kept my silence, the 4-4-4-4 breathing cycle anchoring me as the Aleppo flashbacks the smell of cordite and white heat threatened to pull me back. The scent of chlorine seemed to intensify, burning my throat as I stared at the congealed blood on the linoleum. The lab was no longer just a location. It was a psychological trap designed specifically for me. I looked at Sterling, who had stopped scanning the ceiling and was now staring at me with a lethal, narrow-eyed curiosity. The threat assessment in the room had shifted fundamentally. I was no longer just a nurse with a limp or a ghost he needed to retrieve. I was a variable in a conspiracy he did not fully comprehend. "What is he talking about, Vance?" he whispered, his voice low and dangerous, the safety on his weapon clicking off with a sound that felt like a hammer hitting an anvil. I ignored the question, my focus shifting to the digital file that had just appeared on the flickering terminal screen as Vane bypassed Sterling's access. It was a research log, dated 20 years ago, the text scrolling upward in a blur of medical jargon. The header bore a name that made the world tilt on its axis, sending a jolt of cold lightning through my spine. Dr. Elias Vance, my father. My analytic overlay struggled to maintain its grip on the data. The virus was not a new creation from the Blackwell labs. It was a refined, weaponized version of my father's original work, a defensive antibody research program that had been meant to save lives, now twisted into a tool for mass extinction. I felt a cold, hollow sensation in my chest, a realization that my entire military career had been a byproduct of a family secret I was never supposed to find. Vane continued his lecture, his voice echoing through the brutalist halls with a haunting, rhythmic quality. "You were always the perfect subject, Ilara. The rare antibody, the silent pulse that kept you alive in the ruins of that hospital, while the others turned to liquid. I felt the phantom heat of the Syrian sun on my skin, the smell of burning hair and charred meat. He was referring to the seed. My survival was a biological ledger he intended to read. Sterling approached, hand hovering over his holster. "He is saying you are the cure," he said, his voice flat with clinical coldness. I looked at my hands, the skin pale and translucent under the emergency lights, seeing the blueprint of my own death and the city's salvation mapped out in my veins. My agency index was spiking, but so were the stakes of every breath I took. I was not just the operator anymore. I was the primary asset, a walking laboratory in a city that was about to be burned to the ground. The terminal beeped a sharp, high-pitched rhythmic sound that signaled a total system purge. The data was being wiped, the lines of code vanishing into a digital void. Vane's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, a sound that felt as if it were coming from inside my own head. "I'm leaving you a gift, Ilara. A reminder of Aleppo, and the work your father started." The intercom went dead. Sterling lunged for the data drive, but I was focused on the hidden vent near the ceiling tiles. A faint, greenish mist began to curl into the room, swirling in the air currents like a malevolent spirit. The scent of bitter almonds and ozone filled the space, a neurotoxin that did not just kill it, paralyzed. We had exactly 60 seconds before our lungs seized up. I did not wait for Sterling's command or his permission. I grabbed a heavy oxygen tank from the rack and swung it with every ounce of my strength against the reinforced glass of the emergency exit. The sound of the impact was a thunderclap in the dark, the first step in a tactical withdrawal that was quickly becoming a race against our own mortality. The emergency exit gave way with a structural groan, the reinforced glass spiderwebbing into a million crystalline fractures before the pressure of the oxygen tank finally punched a hole through the center. I dragged Sterling through the jagged opening, just as the greenish mist began to settle into the lower layers of the lab's air, a creeping emerald fog that promised a total respiratory shutdown. My left leg screamed with a white-hot agony as I landed on the concrete floor of the utility corridor, the impact jarring the pins in my tibia. I ignored the pain, anchoring my focus on the 4444 breathing cycle, the rhythm of my own survival, the only constant in a world that was rapidly dissolving into a biochemical tomb. The corridor smelled of damp concrete and ancient dust, a stark, earthy contrast to the almond-scented death we had just escaped. Behind us, the heavy door hissed as the vacuum seal re-engaged, locking the neurotoxin away, but also cutting us off from our only extraction route. We were trapped in the brutalist bowels of my father's legacy, a maze of pipes and flickering low-voltage lights that stretched into the dark like the veins of a dying giant. Sterling recovered his footing with a jagged, gasping breath, his weapon tracking the shadows with a frantic lateral motion. "He is in the server room," he whispered, his voice cracking with the onset of adrenaline-induced tremors. "If he wipes the local backup, we lose the blueprint for the antibody." I looked at him, my analytic overlay registering the micro-tremors in his hands and the slight dilation of his pupils. He was operating on pure instinct now, a hunter who had lost the scent but refused to abandon the chase. We moved toward the heavy, lead-lined doors of the central server room, the air vibrating with the high-frequency whine of cooling fans and the rhythmic electronic pulse of a massive data transfer. I felt the weight of the moral double-bind pressing against my chest. Vane was not just running, he was auditing our souls. I knew the microphysics of the choice before it even crystallized. The sample sat in a portable BSL-4 case on the far console, and Sterling was moving toward a tripwire that my tactical training registered as a lethal kinetic trap. I saw the glint of the monofilament wire. A thin, deadly silver line stretched across the primary walkway, just as Vane's voice returned to the intercom. "A choice, Captain." Vane's voice was a smooth, clinical purr. "The cure, or the agent. One survives, one is erased." The tripwire was not connected to an alarm. It was connected to a pressurized canister of liquid nitrogen overhead. Sterling was 2 inches from triggering a flash, freeze that would turn his lungs into brittle glass. I saw the portable case on the console, the vial of the antibody gleaming like a promise in the blue light of the servers. I could reach it if I sprinted. I could save the city. But Sterling would be a frozen statue before I could turn around. The decision did not require a debate. It required a triage. I lunged forward, not for the vial, but for Sterling's waist, my body weight tackling him into a row of server racks just as his boot brushed the monofilament. The overhead valve hissed, a massive, freezing cloud of nitrogen billowing into the space where he had stood a millisecond before. The air turned into a fog of ice, the temperature dropping so fast the metal racks began to crack with the sound of gunshots. I felt the biting cold on my skin, a jagged reminder of the cost of my humanity. The BSL-4 case was gone. By the time the nitrogen cloud settled, the far door of the server room was swinging shut, and the terminal showed a total data wipe. Vane had used the distraction to retrieve the only clean sample and vanish into the maintenance tunnels that fed directly into the Chicago subway system. Sterling lay beneath me, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a new, unspoken recognition of what I had just sacrificed. "You let him go," he breathed, the words heavy with the realization that the city's salvation was now a fleeing shadow in the dark. I did not answer. I stood up, my limp more pronounced now, the cold of the room settling into my bones. The cure was lost to the tunnels, but the seed was still flowing through my veins. I looked at the dark, empty doorway, my agency index focusing on the only trail left, the bloody prints of Julian Vane's boots. We were not chasing a sample anymore. We were chasing the ghost of Aleppo into the deep, echoing dark of the metro. The transition from the lab's brutalist concrete to the dripping, soot-stained tunnels of the Chicago metro felt like descending into a lower circle of hell. The air here was a stagnant soup of ozone, stagnant water, and the distant, rhythmic vibration of the city's dying pulse. I moved through the dark, the tactical light on Sterling's weapon casting long, jagged shadows that danced across the rusted rails and the peeling posters of a world that no longer existed. My left leg was a constant, throbbing anchor, the pins in my bone vibrating in sympathy with the low-frequency rumble of a National Guard train moving somewhere on the surface. We were deep beneath the legal hold, in a space where the rules of the FBI and the CDC were replaced by the microphysics of the hunt. Every drop of water hitting the track sounded like a hammer on an anvil, the echoes multiplying in the damp dark, until I could no longer tell where Vane's footsteps ended, and the tunnel's natural groans began. I kept my breathing in the 4-4-4-4 cycle, fighting the rising tide of claustrophobia that always accompanied the smell of subterranean decay. We found him at the junction of the Blue Line, a crossroads of iron and shadow where the tunnels widened into a vaulted chamber. Julian Vane stood on the edge of the platform, the BSL-4 case held in his left hand, his right hand gripping a small, matte black device that pulsed with a steady amber light. A bio-trigger. My analytic overlay registered the threat immediately. The device was slave to his heart rate. If his pulse stopped or spiked beyond a certain threshold, the case would vent the refined virus directly into the subway's ventilation system, turning the city's underground into a pressurized gas chamber. He looked older in the harsh light of Sterling's barrel, his skin like yellowed parchment, his eyes reflecting a cold, academic madness that I had never been able to forget. "You have always been so predictable, Alara," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber with a hollow metallic ring. "The nurturing instinct, the nurse's soul. You saved the man, and in doing so, you ensured the end of the city." Sterling held the muzzle steady, the tension in his trigger finger balanced against the professional fear of the trigger. I stepped into the light, my hands visible, my posture a deliberate mask of professional calm. "It is over, Julian," I said. My voice was a low-frequency anchor, designed to settle his heart rate, to keep the trigger in its dormant state. I moved toward him, the microphysics of my limp creating a rhythmic, non-threatening sound on the concrete. I analyzed his grip. It was tight, the tendons in his wrists standing out like wires. He was waiting for the confrontation, the final lecture before the end. I moved closer, ignoring Sterling's frantic signal to stop. I was not Sarah the nurse anymore. I was Captain Vance, negotiating a surrender in a war that had never really ended. I could see the minute-to-minute decay in his own features, the slight tremor in his lip, the way he favored his right side. He was exposed, just like I was. The virus he had spent 20 years perfecting was already eating him from the inside out. He was not a doctor anymore. He was a symptom. "I will not let you see the dawn, Alara," Vane whispered, and for a second the academic mask slipped, revealing the raw, jagged trauma of Aleppo beneath. He bit down on a hidden capsule of cyanide, the scent of bitter almonds hitting the air as his body seized. I lunged forward, my hands moving with a surgical precision that bypassed the panic of the moment. I grabbed the BSL-4 case just as his fingers lost their grip, and I slammed the manual override switch on the side of the biotrigger, short-circuiting the dead man's switch before his heart could flatline. Vane collapsed onto the cold, soot-stained concrete, his eyes rolling back in his head, the BSL-4 case secure in my arms. He was dead. The ghost finally laid to rest in the dirt, but the victory was hollow. I looked down at my own hands and saw the first faint, dark lines beginning to trace the veins in my wrists. The confrontation was over, but the infection was just beginning to speak. The silence that followed Julian Vane's final, ragged breath was heavier than the soot-stained air of the blue-lined tunnels, a dense, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen from my lungs. He lay on the cold, unforgiving concrete like a discarded puppet whose strings had been cut by a surgical blade, his eyes fixed on a vaulted ceiling he could no longer see, the faint, bitter scent of almonds from the cyanide rising like a toxic incense in the stagnant dark. I knelt beside him, the BSL-4 case gripped tightly against my ribs, feeling the first subtle tremors of my own exposure beginning to vibrate through the marrow of my bones like a distant, subterranean earthquake. My analytic overlay was screaming in a frantic digital pulse. His heart had stopped, and with it, the biological pump that had sustained the very antibodies the city needed had fallen silent. I looked at Sterling, whose tactical light was shaking in a jagged, rhythmic arc, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the rusted rails like spectres. He was staring at the corpse of the man who had haunted our careers for 2 decades, his threat assessment completely paralyzed by the catastrophic scale of the failure. The environment had become an active enemy of time. Every second, the blood stayed stagnant in Vane's rapidly cooling veins, the more the refined antibodies would degrade into useless, inert protein. I did not have a lab, I did not have a sterile field, and I did not have a choice. I had a dead man, a dying city, and a field kit that felt like a child's toy in the face of a prehistoric plague. I reached out and grabbed Sterling's heavy tactical belt, my fingers moving with a surgical, predatory speed that bypassed his confusion and snapped him back into the present. I did not ask for permission. I stripped the belt from his waist with a violent tug and looped it high around Vane's upper thigh, cinching the thick nylon tight against the pelvic brim with a visceral grunt of effort that echoed through the tunnel. I was Sarah the nurse no longer. I was the SOAR captain, conducting a high-stakes battlefield harvest in the dirt. I retrieved my camelback hydration bag from my pack, dumping the remaining liter of water onto the soot-stained tracks with a rhythmic splashing sound that felt like a countdown. I needed a sterile reservoir, and the heavy-duty, medical-grade plastic was the only thing I had that could hold the required volume without leaking. I analyzed the anatomy of the cooling corpse through the layers of tactical gear. The femoral vein would be deep, a dark, hidden river under layers of fat and metabolic waste. I took the large-bore needle from my field kit, the 16-gauge monster, usually reserved for emergency chest decompressions, and drove it into the soft, yielding tissue of Vane's groin. I felt the initial resistance of the skin, the distinct pop of the fascia, and then the dark, thick flood of federal blood began to fill the tubing, a warm, pulsing life force moving from the dead to the living. The warmth of it through the plastic was a jagged contrast to the frigid, damp air of the tunnel, a dark, viscous liquid that carried Chicago's only hope within its cooling hemoglobin. The transfer was a slow, agonizing physics of manual pressure and gravity that seemed to stretch every second into an hour. I squeezed the camelback with both hands, creating a constant vacuum that pulled the blood through the needle, my eyes fixed on the dark, microscopic lines beginning to trace the veins in my own wrists like ink, spreading through wet parchment. My left hand was beginning to lose its grip, the neurotoxin from the lab or the virus itself starting to fray my neural connections, making every muscle twitch an act of sheer will. I reached for a small pressurized CO2 canister, the kind used for the rapid inflation of tactical vests, and cracked the internal seal with a sharp twist. The hiss was a sharp, crystalline sound that echoed through the vaulted chamber, the gas expanding so rapidly it turned the air around the camelback into a thick, swirling fog of ice. Flash freeze. I needed to lock the antibodies in a state of metabolic stasis before the chemical decay of death claimed them. As I reached to adjust the flow, the microphysics of my own exhaustion betrayed me. My fingers, numb from the cold and the infection, slipped on the frozen plastic, and a jagged bird edge of the BSL-4 case caught the sensitive skin of my right forearm. It was a shallow 3-inch scratch, but in this environment, it was a death sentence. Vane's blood, still warm and dark, smeared across the open wound, mixing with my own in a visceral, irreversible communion of infection. The world tilted on its axis with a sickening lurch, the flickering red emergency lights of the metro station becoming a blurred, bloody haze that pulsed in time with my racing heart. I felt the exposure hit my system like a physical weight, a crushing, internal pressure that made the 4-4-4-4 breathing cycle feel like trying to inhale molten lead. I looked at my arm and saw the veins beginning to blacken, the dark toxin tracing a jagged path toward my heart with a clinical, terrifying speed that mocked my medical training. I had succeeded in the harvest, but I had failed the survival. I shoved the frozen, blood-filled camelback into Sterling's hands, my voice a ragged, low-frequency rasp that I barely recognized as my own. "Take it to the BSL-4 lab. Do not wait for me, Dominic. The seed is in there." Sterling grabbed me, his hands shaking with a raw, jagged terror that finally collapsed his professional distance. I could feel his heart rate spiking against my shoulder, a frantic human rhythm that stood in stark contrast to the cold, absolute silence of the man at my feet. I did not see the light at the end of the tunnel anymore. I only saw the dark spreading ink in my own skin, the silent pulse of the virus finally finding its home in my blood. I collapsed. The cold, soot-stained concrete of Chicago's bowels, the last thing I felt before the dark took everything, and the world went quiet. The atmosphere of the BSL-4 isolation unit was a pressurized clinical cage of white plastic and the constant high-frequency hum of the air scrubbers that seemed to vibrate in my very teeth. I was encased in a positive pressure suit, the internal airflow, a dry, rhythmic hiss that felt like a mechanical, heartless surrogate for my own failing lungs. Beyond the thick, triple-paned glass, the world was a blurred montage of blue tactical lights and the silent, frantic movement of the Blackwell medical team, their faces obscured by their own hoods. I looked down at my hands through the plastic visor. The veins were no longer just lines. They were dark, jagged rivers of obsidian, tracing a map of my own extinction toward my neck. The virus was winning, its microphysics dismantling my cellular defenses with a clinical precision that Julian Vane would have admired from his grave. I was the last subject, the walking, breathing laboratory of my father's dark legacy, and the dawn was still a cold, distant promise on the other side of the smoke-filled Chicago skyline. My analytic overlay was a chaotic mess of red alerts and failing sensors. My core temperature was dropping into the danger zone, and my heart rate was a sluggish, uneven blip on the overhead monitor that sounded like a funeral drum. I was Sarah Vance, and I was dying in a room built to contain the ghosts of a war I had never asked to fight. I knew the protocol, even as my mind began to fray at the edges. It was not in any textbook or CDC manual. It was a memory of Elias Vance, a theoretical burn he had whispered about in the middle of the night, when the world was still sane and I was just his daughter. The adrenaline protocol. It was not a miracle. It was a desperate, brutal choice to turn the human body into a furnace that the virus could not survive. I reached for the infusion pump with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else, my movements slow and uncoordinated, the pins in my left leg vibrating with a phantom pain that seemed to be the only thing grounding me to reality. I set the dosage, a lethal, high-level concentration of pure epinephrine that would either restart my system with the force of a lightning strike or simply shatter my heart against my ribs. I felt the cold, sharp bite of the needle through the suit's access port, and then the rush hit. It was not a heat. It was an explosion of white, electric fire that slammed into my chest like a kinetic round. My heart did not just beat. It hammered against my sternum with a sound like a heavy diesel engine struggling to stay alive. The pain was absolute and all-consuming, a jagged internal tearing that made me want to scream until my lungs burst, but the air in my chest was too hot to move. I stayed in the 4-4-4-4 cycle, fighting to keep the mask of professional calm, even as the world around me dissolved into a blinding kaleidoscope of static and fire. The fever finally broke, with a violence that left me gasping and shivering against the cold plastic floor of the unit, my vision slowly clearing of the red haze. I felt the sweat soaking through my scrubs, a cold, cloying dampness that signified the virus's retreat from the overwhelming heat of the adrenaline. I looked at my wrists and watched as the dark lines began to fade, the obsidian rivers retreating back into the pale, translucent skin of my forearms like a tide going out. The dawn was finally breaking over Chicago, a thin grey sliver of light that cut through the emergency beacons and the lingering smoke of the city's siege, turning the brutalist architecture into a city of silver. Sterling was standing at the glass, his face a map of absolute exhaustion, and a new, unspoken relief that he could not quite mask even with his FBI training. He held up a digital terminal for me to see. The cure was being synthesized from the harvest I had pulled from the tunnels. The city was saved. The legal hold was lifting from the population, and the shadow doctor was nothing more than a ghost in a jar. I looked at the morning light hitting the white walls of the lab, and felt the weight of my father's work finally settling into a quiet, earned peace. I had burned the virus out of my blood, but the cost was carved forever into my bones. I was a survivor of Aleppo, a SOAR captain who had triumphed in a war of microscopic predators, and I was ready to go back to being a ghost in the rain. 6 months later, the Seattle rain was the same grey, rhythmic drumming against the heavy glass windows of Oak Creek Manor, a sound that I had come to find more comforting than silence. I pushed the medication cart down the long hallway of the 4th floor, the wheels groaning in their familiar industrial cadence that matched the beating of my own heart. Manager Brooks was long gone, replaced by a woman who did not care about my limp or my past, and Martha Eleanor Reed was still clutching her patchwork quilt in the soft shadow of the morning. I was Sarah the nurse again, the mask of a quiet janitor, fitting comfortably over the jagged scars of a soldier. I stopped at the mailroom on my way to the break room and picked up a single, nondescript postcard with a postmark from Chicago. It was blank on the back, except for 3 words written in a sharp, professional hand that I recognized instantly. Call when you are ready. I looked at my hands, the skin clear and the grip steady on the cold metal handle of the cart, and I felt the challenge coin in my pocket, a heavy, hidden weight of a life I knew I could never truly leave behind. I tucked the card into my pocket next to the coin and moved into Eleanor's room, my voice a flat, compliant anchor in the quiet morning air. The dawn had come, the city had survived, and the silent pulse of the world continued its steady, invisible beat.